Welcome to Unapologetically Sensitive, a place to find connection, a sense of belonging, and community, where you can learn, relate, laugh, and maybe even live a bolder, brighter life. I'm your host, Patricia Young, licensed clinical social worker. The information in this podcast is not a substitute for help from a licensed mental health professional. This is a weekly podcast where we explore how sensitivity weaves itself into our lives. We talk about the richness that it adds, the strengths we have because of our sensitivity, and some of the challenges it poses as well. Sensitivity is nothing to apologize for. It's our superpower. Hey there to the creatives, healers, sensitives, deep thinkers. Thank you for joining me. This is episode 0 of Unapologetically Sensitive. In this episode, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what you can expect from this podcast, and I'm going to give you a little bit of information about me, and then I'm going to treat you to some recordings that I did prior to starting this podcast, where I talk about some of the fears that are coming up for me, because that's really what this podcast is about. My hope is for anyone who has ever felt different, alone, isolated, that you're weird, that something is wrong with you, my hope is that this podcast is a place where you will connect and find out more about who you are. My hope is that in every episode you will hear something and say, oh my gosh, I didn't think there was anybody else like that. That's just like me. It may or may not happen, I don't know, but that's really what my goal is. My experience growing up was that I felt really different from everybody else. And this podcast is, if you know you're a highly sensitive person, if you're someone who feels things, if you're someone who thinks about things, pretty much anybody who's been told you're T-O-O, too much, too needy, you think too much, you worry too much, you can't take a joke, you're too picky, this podcast is for you. Also, if you are into the Myers-Briggs and you identify as an INFJ or an ENFJ, I think this podcast will resonate with you. What I'm hoping that people will get from this podcast is a sense of connection, a sense of understanding. You'll really be able to understand what your strengths are and the things that either you've been told are wrong with you or the things that you believe are wrong with you. We're going to look at those and really see what the strengths are. Our society tends to not have a very positive view of sensitivity, and we're going to talk about the language that we use around it, and I'm going to have a number of guests on, and on each episode, we talk about sensitivity and what it means to them, how it's perceived, if they would like to be sensitive or not be sensitive. Most people that identify with some form of sensitivity have felt a sense of overwhelm in their lives. One of the things that we're going to be talking about on the podcast is we're going to be looking at overwhelm and ways to calm and to soothe. We're going to be looking at the 5 love languages. We're going to talk a lot about relationships because people that are sensitive tend to have struggles in relationships. Their partners tell them that they're too sensitive. They feel like something's wrong with them. There's an overlay between wounding in childhood and being a highly sensitive person, and the two often get confused. I've got a number of men that I'm going to talk to that identify with being sensitive because we want to understand what it's like to be a man in a culture that doesn't really value sensitivity. We're going to have some guests on and talk about diversity, people of color, white privilege. We're going to do a lot of talk about fear and how you can show up when you're feeling fear and just being in the process. There's a really high intersection between sensitivity and creativity. Doesn't necessarily mean you have to be an artist or a poet, but the creative part of sensitives is very powerful, and we often don't know that it's there, and learning to recognize it and nurture it can be incredibly powerful. We're also going to talk about play. Some of us, finger pointing at me, struggle with play, but as I've started doing these interviews, I'm really getting some insight on play and seeing that I play way more than I thought I did. It just looks different if you're a sensitive. One of the things that I value the most is vulnerability. And a lot of the episodes that I have in this podcast are going to be about things that I'm either going through, have been through, or I talk about my vulnerability and my fear, and I really like to model what it looks like as I'm going through it. At the end of this, I'm going to play some clips that I recorded as I was anticipating starting the podcast at different stages and the things that I'm worrying about. I'm really grateful that I did, because had I not, I think I would have forgotten the challenges that I was experiencing then. When I'm not on the podcast, I love to swear. I have a potty mouth and it makes me really happy. My plan is not to swear on this podcast. I have a couple of reasons for that. I really want this to be accessible to as many people as possible. I want to be sensitive if parents are listening when their kids are within earshot. The exception to this is this episode, because when I recorded those clips earlier on, I had a potty mouth. And I do have one episode that I've already recorded where the guest didn't know and she said a potty word too. So I will put an explicit warning on this episode and that episode. Well, this is how it goes. To let you know a little bit about me, when I was a kid, what I wanted to be was I either wanted to write a book or I wanted to be a talk show host. The era that I grew up with, or grew up in, the talk show hosts were Merv Griffin, Phil Donahue, and Dinah Shore. And I really felt clear at a very young age that I wanted to be known for who I was. I didn't want to be famous for something that I did, but I really wanted people to see me. And now that I know that I'm a highly sensitive person, it makes sense. So many of us grew up and did not feel seen, heard, or validated. And we've got all of these gifts. We've got insight and humor and compassion and ability to connect. And oftentimes, if we're around either parents that are stressed out, that are not HSPs, there are other things that are going on, we end up not knowing the wonderful gifts that we have. And I think that being seen and being heard can be so incredibly powerful for an HSP. Also, to let you in on a little secret, I've really been struggling with recording this episode. I want to get everything in. I want to get it right. I want it to be perfect. And it's made it really hard for me to record. So I made a decision today that I just was going to sit down and record it. And I think what I'm going to do is when it's done, I'm going to sit with it. And if I need to keep adding, I'm going to add to it. So if it sounds really disjointed at the end and you keep hearing, and another thing, and another thing, I'm going to allow myself the grace to do that because I don't want to sit on this until I get it perfect. You may never hear this podcast. One of my favorite mantras is, done is better than perfect. And as much as I want to give you all the information and say all the perfect things, I just don't think I'm going to be able to do that. My hope is with this podcast, you'll learn, you'll relate, you'll laugh. You'll learn more about yourself and learn to accept the things that maybe right now feel like they're not okay and not acceptable. You'll learn to live a bolder, brighter life. You'll learn to love and accept and recognize your strengths. I love learning. I'm really curious. And so my hope is that I'm going to have some great people to interview on this podcast. I love sharing resources. I love providing education. I've set up a Facebook group. If you just go on Facebook and you search for Unapologetically Sensitive, I'm hoping to have a community where we can really interact. I want to hear from you. I want to provide content that's meaningful to you. At this point, I'm kind of guessing, and I really don't have a sense of the things that you want to hear about. So please jump on over to that Facebook page and let me know how you like the podcast, what things you want to hear about. I'm going to set some polls up over there so I can get to learn a little bit more about you. My plan is at some point is to do a questionnaire that will help me get even more information. If you live in San Diego, I'm a licensed clinical social worker and I provide counseling. I work primarily with highly sensitive people. You don't have to be an HSP to work with me, but you do have to be someone who's ready to jump in and you're curious and you want to learn about yourself. If you happen to live in California and you want to work with me, I do online telehealth. You can go over to my website at patriciayounglcsw.com and learn more about me. If you want to go to the website where the podcast is hosted, it's at unapologeticallysensitive.com. I also have a bunch of videos on my YouTube channel. You can go to YouTube and search Patricia Young LCSW. Finally, if you find this podcast helpful, please share it, subscribe, rate it in iTunes. iTunes has an algorithm that the first, I think it's 60 days that a podcast is out. If it gets a lot of ratings and reviews, it gets put in new and notable so more people are able to find it. So if you find this content valuable, please share it and tell other people about it. Share it on social media. If you want to get in touch with me directly, you can send an email to unapologeticallysensitive gremlins@gmail.com. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and play those clips. They're dated in order, so you can kind of see what the progression is. Thanks so much for being here and for listening. It's September 19th, and I'm still getting ready to prepare for the podcast, and my gremlins are up big time. I am having so much anxiety, and I'm really wanting to forget about having a podcast. The gremlins are telling me I can't do interviews. I'm going to screw them up. There's no point in trying anyways. I probably won't stick with it. I don't have anything to offer. Who the hell am I to think that I can do a podcast about highly sensitive people? I'll never learn the technology. I get overwhelmed too easily, and I could go on forever and fucking forever. It's really been a challenge. I don't even know what to say. I know that when I'm on the edge of pushing my growth, that this comes up for me and I just need to push through it. But sometimes the fear is just incredibly paralyzing, and the shame and the doubt that comes up is very powerful. What I know is to talk about it. Shame can't live in secrecy. And the reason why I'm doing this podcast is I really want people to have a sense that we are not alone in our struggles. And there's lots of joy in the world, and we also have shit that comes up for us. And the shit that comes up for us is not really that bad. It's stuff that we all struggle with. I really want people to have a sense of connection and to know that they're not alone in the things that they struggle about, the way our gremlins come up, and the way that our wounds kind of hold us back. So I'm going to be making a couple of recordings pre-launch that I'm hoping to use once I launch, because I think this is almost a more important part of the process than the actual successful launch of the podcast. We all struggle when we're getting ready to step out and make big changes, and it's really scary. It doesn't mean that we can't do it, though. All right, have a great day. Bye-bye. It's October 3rd, and I have the new setup. I've got about 8 guests scheduled, and I'm really excited. I'm feeling pretty nervous about all of the details. I haven't edited any podcasts yet, and I don't have a lot of systems in place, so I'm feeling more nervous about the logistics. And I've been feeling really nervous about interviewing. What if I can't pay attention? What if it's boring to do in the future? But I'm feeling really afraid that I'm not going to be able to be a good interviewer. What if I don't listen? What if I talk too much about myself? What if I can't stay on track? Had a number of sleepless nights. I fall asleep okay, but then I wake up at maybe 1 a.m. and my mind just starts getting really busy, and it's almost always about the podcast. And then I'm up for a couple of hours, and it kind of wrecks me the next day. But I know this is part of the process for me, that when I start new things, I get really overly focused. I tend to worry about stuff. So the best thing I can do is just have a lot of self-compassion. Know it's part of the process. My plan is to launch by the end of the month. I've submitted for my logo. They're doing some revisions. I've got enough podcasts, guests scheduled. And so we're just going to go for it. It's feeling really surreal. I feel like I've been talking about launching a podcast for a long time, but now that I've got guests and I've got my equipment and I'm learning how to use it, it's feeling pretty exciting. So we'll see how it goes. Maybe the next time you hear me, it's going to actually be on the podcast. Hey there. It's October 4th today, and I'm kind of freaking out. So I thought I'd hop on and make a recording just to let you guys know the stuff that goes on in my head. I have 2 interviews set up tomorrow, and I wanted to make sure that the platform that I'm meeting these people over and using the recording function is going to work. So I did a practice run with someone today. And then when I went to check the files to see how the sound was, I couldn't open the files, and apparently the files need to be converted. I really wanted to freak out. What came up for me is, I can't do this. I don't know what I'm doing. This is too technical. I'm going to screw up. It was a stupid idea to have a podcast. What the heck am I thinking? I mean, this were just my automatic thoughts. I still, on a scale of 1 to 10, where 10 is pretty amped up, I'm at about a 6. So I reached out to some of the people that I get support from, and I just have to find a program that can convert the files from where I recorded so that I can upload them and edit them. And it was really nice. A very close friend of mine, I talked to her briefly when I was sort of freaking out, reminded me that I'm really resourceful, I'm persistent, that I'm just really rocking this. But it's so interesting how, and we'll talk more about this later, but the parts of us that are younger that felt really defeated and felt like we just couldn't do anything, that's what comes up for me. But I just want to continue to share the obstacles in my thinking that are coming up. And, this is a technological problem that I'm going to need to figure out how to resolve. And I need to do it before tomorrow because I've got 2 interviews scheduled. And the reality is things are going to get screwed up. Like, that's just how life is. We have glitches, we have problems. Sometimes no matter what we do, there's so much that's out of my control. And I think that if I prepare for there being mistakes, then when they happen, I'm not going to feel so devastated. And what I have such strong feelings about is I want to model imperfection and vulnerability, and that we show up the best that we can, and that life is going to have struggles and mistakes. And it's not about having the perfect blissful life. It's about learning how to lean into those struggles and challenges when they happen. And then when we get the blissful periods, we ride them and enjoy them. So this really is an ongoing opportunity for me to be able to make mistakes and to be okay with it, and to model that it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay for me to be freaking out over these things. Now, if I want to stay freaked out for the rest of the day and ruin the rest of my day, that's going to kind of suck for me. So what I've done is I've reached out, I've gotten some support. I know where I need to look to get the answers, and that when I get back this afternoon, I'm going to have to hop on the computer and figure some of this stuff out. The fearful thoughts will continue to come up. I know that that's what happens when there's new things, especially around technology, because there's just a lot of moving parts and pieces that I'm not familiar with. Once I get familiar with it, it's not going to be an issue, which is why I'm doing these recordings now, because it's possible that a few episodes in, I'm not even going to remember that I was struggling and that it was an issue. But today, I feel like you got to, pry me off the ceiling, because I really got panicky about what am I going to do, and then I made a mistake. It's just a mistake. It's not even a mistake. It just was information. When I reached out to somebody for support, he's like, oh, I forgot to tell you about that. It's October 20th, and we're pretty close to launching, and I'm getting really excited. I've got the logo now, and I absolutely love it. I worked with another graphic designer, and it just was really not meant to be, and it ended up being for the better that we didn't work together, because I ended up changing the name of the podcast, and I love the logo. I've recorded about 6 episodes so far, and yesterday I spent 6 to 7 hours editing one episode. I was exhausted. I'd been really intimidated. I've told you that the technology really kind of makes me nervous. But what I saw is I am so persistent. And what I think happened is I probably overworked it. The audio quality of the interview was just not very good, so I needed to buy some additional equipment. Without getting too technical, I probably didn't need to do the work that I did once I send it to this company that will clean up the audio. It probably would have been taken care of, but I didn't know that. So the next couple things that are up for me are also feeling big and intimidating, but because I've been listening to my recordings along the way and watching the progress, I'm not feeling as frightened as I was before. I think what happens is when there are new things, we tend to get really frightened. And each time we suit up and show up and do one little thing, it ends up building confidence. And so even though I still have a number of things ahead of me in order to get this podcast out to you all, by the time you hear this, I will have done all those things. But I still feel like there are a number of things that feel big and scary. But as I've approached each one of these tasks and figured out what I need to do to learn each little step, and I've made mistakes, and that's okay, my confidence is really building. And I'm finding that I'm loving doing the interviews. I was really nervous, and I was preparing a lot for them. And then the last couple ones, I'm just learning what the rhythm is. And so I had booked a little too many interviews in a day and had too many things going on and didn't prepare. And I had to remind myself, I'm really good talking to people. Like, all I have to do is show up and talk. What my hope is that you get out of this is that it's not about doing anything perfectly. It's about just showing up
and learning as we go. And that's where the confidence comes. If I had waited until I had the confidence, you guys would never be hearing my voice. And the feedback that I'm getting from people about the content that I'm putting out is it's resonating. And that's really what my goal was to just have this resonate with people. If there's anything that I can do to encourage people, I know what it's like to be in that stuck place where you're just looking at what you're not doing and it feels like whatever you're doing isn't enough and you're not good enough. That's where the self-compassion comes in. And just to know that that's where you're at for today. And if there's one little step that you can take, that's all you have to do. Maybe the next time you'll hear my voice will actually be on the podcast.
Thank you so much for being here today. I'm so grateful you took the time to listen. I really want to set up a community where I can hear from you and know what you like or what you don't like to hear about topics. There's a Facebook group called Unapologetically Sensitive. If you want to hop on over there, I'm going to set up some polls, but I really want to create content that's meaningful to you. If you'd like to join my weekly newsletter, my plan is to send out just one newsletter a week letting you know about the upcoming episode, anything that's coming up. You can go to unapologeticallysensitive.com if you'd like to sign up and be on the email list. If you want to reach out to me directly, you can go to the same website and there's a tab where you can send me an email. Being sensitive is nothing to apologize for. It's our superpower. Have a blessed day.